Chapter 38. New friend?
Just for a few minutes, and I'll stay by the fence,
BB told himself repeatedly under his breath as his magic undid the lock that held the back door shut. With a satisfying thunk, it was unlocked, and he slid it open with only a slight wince of effort. The warm summer air washed over his face, and he took a moment to let it refresh his mind. He then glanced back over his shoulder at Buddha, who was watching him with curious confusion. He smiled back at her in reassurance.
I'm just heading out for a couple minutes,
he told her, though if he were being honest, he was really trying to assure himself of that. He turned his head to look outside, and, for a moment, he hesitated. This would be the first time in his entire life that he had actively, knowingly, and willfully went directly against Eventide's wishes, something that he had learned even during his very earliest of days was a bad thing. Any misstep, any undesired or forbidden action, any risk-taking typically resulted in a sudden cutoff from his food supply, and sickening feelings would always take their place until he managed to make amends. But right now, Eventide wasn't here, and BB was already feeling sick of being not just lonely, but incapable of getting back to sleep. He took a deep breath to steady his nerves and stepped outside.
Dad doesn't have to know, and it's just this one time,
he assured himself quickly before using his magic to close the door behind him. He could see Buddha approaching the glass with a concerned look on her face, and the glow in the air around her reflected this. BB gave her another small smile, then began to trot further into the yard. He made his way right up to the fence, then hopped on top of it. His ascent was aided by a quick buzz of his wings, and his hooves quickly found purchase on one of the many posts that made up the structure. Once he had his balance, he scanned the area behind the house curiously while running over a plan in his head. It was pretty simple, all things considered. He would stay next to the fence and just explore for a little while, hopefully finding a few small animals to interact with. They might not have been able to speak back to him, but at least they could provide some unpredictable entertainment. The squirrel from the previous evening had been a good example of that, and it had felt good to help the poor guy out. BB nodded to himself as he finalized things in his head, then hopped down from the fence into the grass on the other side. His wings buzzed and slowed his descent, and his hooves lightly touched down on the cool ground. He idly sniffed at a few flowers that were poking up by his hoof, then stuck out his tongue once he realized they were dandelions. He didn't like dandelions. So he moved on, holding true to his intent and sticking close by the fence. His eyes scanned the small, narrow field of tall grass that served as the border between his house and the forest for anything of interest. Sadly, it wasn't exactly a large region to explore, and as it was right next to his house, animals of any kind were scarce. He did find a small anthill, but quickly ran away from it when he saw the inhabitants going about their business. Creepy crawlies. Ugh, nope. But alas, that was the extent of what he found. Ants. In this small area, there was nothing else for him to find. BB gave off a loud, childish, and disappointed whine at his little adventure being cut so unceremoniously short. He sagged and turned back to the fence, ready to return home. But then, he turned and looked over his shoulder at the forest. The trees were tall evergreens, and their sheer scale was always a source of awe and intimidation for BB. He really shouldn't go in there unless Eventide was home to supervise. He really shouldn't. Maybe just a few feet wouldn't hurt? BB swallowed down his anxiety and started towards the edge of the forest at a slow and tentative pace. Just as he was about to cross the threshold, his mind recalled the foxes and the raccoons and how dangerous Eventide always told him they were. And he knew it, too, having seen them hunt other, smaller creatures. He felt a chill run up his spine at the thought of being pinned down and bitten at by a hungry fox. BB stepped back and then looked up at the trees. After a few moments of searching the branches, he saw one that looked promising. His wings snapped out from his back and buzzed into life, sending him sailing through the air and into a solid landing on his desired perch. It shuddered and swayed under his weight for a moment, and some of the needle-like leaves fell to the forest floor below. It held strong, though, and Bibi breathed out a sigh of relief before gazing ahead again. Now he had a much higher view of the land, and he would be safe from any unfriendly animals. So with that, he scanned the grounds beneath him, curiously searching for any signs of animal life that would be safe to interact with. A squirrel, a mouse, a chipmunk, anything like that. There was nothing, sadly. With a pout, he looked around before leaping from his branch and to another one on the next tree. His wings gave a quick burst of movement as he moved through the air, ensuring he had the airtime he needed. Once he landed, he repeated the previous steps. Search for animals, and if he found none, move on to another spot. And so it continued. Bibi jumped from branch to branch, and at one point he couldn't help but think fondly back to that bouncing lemur he would sometimes watch on the TV. Zaboomafoo, if he was remembering the name right. That or Tarzan. In fact, it was actually kind of fun to just jump from branch to branch. Bibi's eyes widened slightly as he reached this conclusion, and a quiet giggle slipped out of him. He turned his eyes and spotted a branch that was somewhat above him and further than the others. His tongue stuck out the side of his mouth, and his rear gave a cat-like wiggle before he leapt for it. He misjudged his trajectory and the distances involved, and he had to strain his wings to close the gap. His hooves hooked around the branch, and he grunted with effort as his chest thumped into the wood. His hind legs kicked out for a moment, looking for some purchase, and found it in the form of the tree trunk. Pushing off, he managed to haul himself up, panting, onto the branch. Once he was sure he was safe, he settled down to catch his breath. Then he started chuckling. That had been exhilarating. It had been scary for a second, yes, and he might have fallen, but he didn't. And even if he had, he could have just used his wings to slow his fall and safely land somewhere else. His young and impressionable mind feeling emboldened and empowered by those thoughts and his display of acrobatics, Bibi stood back up, his eyes eagerly searching for another target to jump for. He soon found it a little ways below him and grinned. He readied himself, judged the distance, and made the leap. And that was when everything went wrong. The branch he had been standing on was not as sturdy as he had first thought. The sudden push of his hind legs kicking out caused it to snap and drop away from under his hooves with a loud and echoing crack. Bibi's eyes flew wide, and his heart leapt into his throat as he abruptly plummeted several feet into the air. He let out a startled shout, and his wings frantically buzzed into motion, trying to stop his downward momentum. As successful as that effort was, he forgot to counter his forward momentum. He saw the trunk of his target tree coming for his face a second too late. His muzzle cracked into it, and searing pain exploded inside of his skull. Bibi screamed, his hooves flying up to his nose. His wings fell out of sync, and his body entered into a free fall from the air. He didn't have any time to react before his side crashed into another branch sticking out of the tree, driving the breath from his lungs. He tried to grab onto the branch, but in his dazed state, he was unable to grip it tight enough before his own weight made him slide off the side and fall again. The next branch got him right in the belly, driving what few scraps of air he had left out of his lungs. He wheezed before rolling back and off of the branch, his vision swimming. He fell for several seconds before his right flank cracked against a raised portion of the tree's roots that stuck up out of the earth. The impact was accompanied by a sickening crunch, and he bounced off the root to hit the forest floor with a thump and a gasp. Everything fell quiet and still, and for several seconds, Bibi didn't dare to move a single muscle. If he was in pain, he couldn't feel it just then. His mind was swimming and foggy, and his vision was having a hard time focusing on anything. Finally, though, his senses began to return to him, and he groaned in pain when he realized just how sore his entire body was. He sighed to himself as it occurred what had just happened, and why.
Oh, I'm such an idiot.
He moaned dejectedly before pushing his front hooves under him and trying to stand. An ear-splitting scream of agony tore past his lips when incredible pain flared into existence across his right flank, causing him to fall right back down. Gasping rapidly, BB shifted to get a look at where it hurt, and to his horror, saw that the chitin there had been cracked where it had hit the root. A tiny trickle of blood could be seen seeping out of it. The sight drew another, more terrified scream out of him. He buzzed his wings on his back in an effort to fly, but to his horror, he found it difficult to coordinate their movements through the pain.
No.
He thought in total panic, trying and once again failing to stand up.
I can't be hurt. Not out here. That's not here to help me. What if some big mean animal comes along? I can't run. I can't fly. Are they going to eat me?
The mental image of the fox from before returned to his mind, and BB's panic swelled several times over. He shouted and began to pull himself along the forest floor, desperately searching for any familiar marks or trees so he could get home. He would have no such luck. Everything around him was completely unfamiliar, and to his swiftly growing despair, he realized he had gone much further out into the forest than he had first thought. He must have gotten lost in his thoughts and not paid any real attention to where he was going. He was such an idiot. If he just stayed at home and sucked it up, he could have waited for Eventide and played when he got home. But no, he just had to come out here, be a bad son, and get himself hurt. Now he was injured, all alone, and probably about to be eaten by a hungry and scary wild animal. There was nothing else. BB did all he could do. He began to cry. His pained, frightened, and trembling voice echoed throughout the woods around him, announcing his presence to anything and everything nearby.
Dad!
He screamed as loud as he could, hoping against hope that the man was somewhere in earshot, that he would come to the rescue like he always did.
Daddy, help me!
But of course, Eventide wasn't there. He was probably working on clearing off a forest trail a good few miles away. BB was all on his own. He whimpered and began to cry even louder at the thought as he desperately attempted to pull himself across the forest floor. He needed to find somewhere safe to hide, somewhere where he could wait for Eventide to come looking for him. Had he looked at the ground instead of at the trees overhead, he might have realized that, as he was rounding the trunk, he was crawling right for a small drop in the terrain that marked an overhang of dirt, roots, and moss. He only realized it was there when his hoof slipped over the edge, and he went falling down with another scream of surprise. He landed on his left side, thankfully, but that did little to shield his injury from the pieces of dirt that followed him as he fell. They pummeled into his side for a moment, making him curl up into a ball and let off a terrified wail. The dirt stopped falling on him after a moment. He lay there for several seconds, gasping raggedly and frantically trying to quell his frightened cries, now blindingly aware of just how loud he was being. But despite his best efforts, he could still hear his own voice echoing in the trees around him, for something to hear. And something did hear him.
Hello? Is somebody out there?
A young female voice with an odd accent called from somewhere in the trees, causing BB to go rigid. His cries became caught in his throat, and his eyes went wide. Someone was coming. A person. A human. His mind began to race like a rocket, a whole new form of panic setting in. He didn't know this person, and they were about to find him. He wasn't supposed to let people see him, not in his real form at least. He tried to scoot himself a little further under the overhang for cover, but there wasn't much space for him. He let a very inappropriate word slip out from under his breath before perking his ears up and listening for the stranger. Maybe if he held still and didn't make a sound, they wouldn't find him?
Is somebody hurt?
The voice called again, closer this time. Bibi could hear her feet on the dirt now.
I thought I heard screaming.
His face paled. With the angle they were approaching from, there was no way he could hide himself from the stranger. With adrenaline pumping through his veins, Bibi closed his eyes and began to focus on his magic. In his mind's eye, he saw the green flame emerge, and without direction, he channeled it into his body.
Please, help me!
He mentally shouted at the fire.
Make me a dog, or a mouse, or a cat, I don't know! Just turn me into something that will keep me safe from her!
His magic flickered in response to his request, and his body was engulfed in a swirl of green flames. The familiar sensation of his body rapidly changing shape surged through his system, but whatever he became was not a shape he was familiar with. He didn't dare open his eyes to look and see what he had turned into, though. He was focusing all of his attention on just holding the form and listening to the person coming his way. They were getting closer. Closer. They stopped.
Oh my gosh. Hey, little boy, are you okay?
The voice suddenly called out, filled with worry and concern. Confused, Bibi opened one eye and glanced in the voice's direction. There, rushing towards him with wide eyes and a hanging jaw, was a teenager who looked stunningly familiar. She had bright yellow skin and bouncy, curly red hair that reached down to her shoulder blades. She had peach-colored eyes that radiated with fear and concern that Bibi found perplexing. She was wearing a green t-shirt, a pair of plain blue jeans, and some sort of brown outdoor shoes. She also had a backpack slung over her shoulder, one which she was in the process of taking off as she approached. She slid to a stop by Bibi's side and then knelt down next to him, her eyes glued onto his injury. All the while, Bibi never once took his eyes off of her. In fact, he began to try and squirm away, whimpering all the while. She looked into his eyes and put on a comforting smile, her hands raising in a placating gesture.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, easy. Easy there, kiddo. It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you. I promise. You're gonna be okay, all right? I gotcha.
Bibi paused, confused by her words and her tone. Still shaking, he finally looked down at his body to see what she was seeing. His eyes flew wide open when he saw that he had assumed the form of a young human boy, dressed in identical clothes to what Eventide had been wearing when he left. A dark green t-shirt and thick cargo pants. His feet were adorned in plain white socks and basic brown shoes. A human. Bibi had turned into a human. In retrospect, he supposed it made sense that he could do that. He just never thought to do so. Maybe he'd felt like the shape was off limits, considering how often he'd been told to stay away from other people. Maybe he'd feared it would be too complicated, and that he wouldn't be able to hold it for long enough to be useful. Whatever the case, he winced and hissed in pain through his teeth when he saw his injury was still there, a red stain starting to spread out from the right side of his waist. The girl who had found him then grimaced.
Oh dear. Okay, just hold still.
She then reached over and unzipped her backpack before reaching inside.
Please tell me I brought it. Please tell me I brought it, please.
Bibi watched her, completely stunned. He swallowed heavily and took the chance to lift one of his newly acquired hands and experiment with it. He tried wiggling his fingers and grimaced at just how odd it felt. Sure, he'd had multiple digits before, like his toes whenever he was in his border collie form, but they were limited in their range of motions a lot more than fingers were, and that wasn't even getting a start on having an opposable thumb. He then reached down and timidly picked at his clothes with the tips of his fingers. He winced in discomfort when he felt the contact on the fabric. It occurred to him that the clothes he was wearing were in fact not really clothes. They were just another part of his body that he had materialized to look like clothes. He was still, technically, naked. His mind was drawn away from his new body when the girl emerged from her backpack with an elated In her hands was a small first aid kit, which he then set down and popped open. As she began to dig through it, her eyes flicked up to BB, meeting his still frightened gaze.
You're gonna be okay, kid. I promise. I'm not here to hurt you. I want to help. What's your name?
She asked him. BB blinked and recoiled a bit. He stammered helplessly before swallowing the lump in his throat.
My dad told me not to talk to strangers.
The girl smiled softly.
Good advice, that. Would it make you feel better if I told you mine?
BB nodded slowly in response.
I guess.
The girl's smile widened and she placed a hand over her chest.
I'm Applebloom. Pleased to meet you.
Applebloom. BB's brow furrowed as he gave that name some thought. It sounded familiar, too. Everything about this girl was just so familiar. Why? Where had he seen her before? Where had he heard that name?
So what's yours?
Applebloom suddenly asked, drawing BB out of his brief reverie. He blinked a few times, trying to find his voice.
My name's BB.
He finally managed to get out, his voice still weak and trembling. Applebloom raised an eyebrow at that.
Baby? Kind of funny name,
she muttered before she smiled warmly at him.
No, but who am I to judge? It's a pleasure to meet you, BB.
He just continued to watch her, absolutely mesmerized by what was happening. But more than that, he was trying to figure out where he knew this Applebloom girl from. He knew he had seen her before, but where? His eyes then widened as a memory from a long time ago resurfaced in his mind.
Hey, shh, it's okay. You're gonna be okay. I got you.
He whispered, spending almost a minute just soothing BB until his cries simmered down. Once he was sure he was calm again, Eventide leaned back.
You're okay. You're gonna be fine. Now, who saw you?
BB hiccuped again.
It was a girl with yellow skin and red hair. She was smaller than Fluttershy, and she was wearing a green shirt.
He managed to say before looking up at Eventide's face.
Daddy, am I gonna be taken away?
No, BB, no. Eventide assured him, his face relaxing somewhat with recognition. He let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. It's okay. You're fine. That was Applebloom. She's just a kid, and nobody believes the kid. Even if she tells anyone, they'll probably just think she's making up stories or something. You're gonna be fine, BB. Nobody's coming to take you away. BB must have felt his dad's relief, because his own expression lit up significantly. There was still an aura of fear and uncertainty about him, though. He swallowed the lump in his throat and asked,
Promise?
Eventide smiled and nodded. I promise.
So, baby, what are you doing out here?
Applebloom suddenly asked in a friendly voice, drawing BB's attention again. She was staring at what looked to be a small bottle of clear, gel-like fluid.
And how'd you get hurt?
BB swallowed heavily again, his shock preventing him from trying to lie.
I was playing in the trees. I fell.
He answered shakily, taken aback by how his voice was lacking its usual double tones. Applebloom frowned at him in disapproval.
You're a little small to be playing in the trees, aren't you?
She pointed out in a deadpan. BB lowered his eyes in shame, and he visibly wilted under her stare.
I was being stupid. Hey, you said it, not me.
Applebloom quipped, and BB saw a small shimmer of yellow around her, the color of mirth and amusement. He chose not to comment on it for now, and watched her work. She took the bottle and held it over his leg injury.
Alright, this is gonna sting real bad. You ready? What is it?
BB questioned fearfully, his eyes locking onto the bottle with trepidation. Applebloom frowned and looked at it.
I'm not even gonna try and pronounce that. It helps kill germs and stuff. You're supposed to put it on cuts and open injuries. I mean, we don't want this to get infected, so if I pour some of it on where you're hurt, it'll help keep you from getting sick. But it really stings. Like, a lot. But that just means it's working, okay?
BB eyed her carefully, scanning the glow around her for any signs of deception. Interestingly, her emotional state remained unchanged and unreadable to him. All he could see from her was a subtle glow of amusement from where he had called himself stupid, and a lot of worry, accompanied by a flicker of determination. Seeing nothing to make him doubt her, BB just nodded.
Okay. Do it.
He relented before screwing his eyes shut and focusing on just holding his form as he waited for the pain. When it hit him, it was incredible. His eyes flew open without his consent, and he screamed long and loud into the air. It felt like liquid fire had just been poured all over his injury, and by reflex his uninjured leg kicked out to hit Applebloom in the hip. She grunted as she fell back, the bottle dropping from her hands and hitting the dirt with a quiet thump.
Ow! Hey!
She protested before coming forward again to assess the situation. She saw the look on his face, and he saw the air around her shimmer with guilt.
Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're all right. This is normal. This is fine. You're gonna be okay. Deep breaths, okay? Can you do that? Come on, deep breaths. Come on.
BB followed her instructions. Thankfully, the pain began to die down rather quickly, and his scream withered away into a pained whimper. He closed his eyes again to focus on stabilizing his form. A few seconds later, he could hear Applebloom digging through the first aid kit again.
Okay, you're doing great. Just hang on. I think I have some band-aids in here somewhere. Boy, am I glad Sweetie convinced me to take that class now.
She muttered before BB felt her setting to work on patching him up. A few minutes passed where the only sounds were that of her working and occasionally uttering hushed reassurances to him. After a time, she pulled back and cleared her throat.
All done,
she proclaimed eagerly. BB reluctantly opened his eyes and looked down at his wounded leg. Something had been placed over the wound, a soft white square of some kind, and a few layers of bandage wrapping had been applied to it, going all around his waist and right leg. Whatever flow of blood there had been was stopped, and the pain was much reduced. He flexed the limb a few times to make sure it was fine, then hissed between his teeth when it once again flared up with pain. It wasn't as bad as before, but it was still pretty nasty. Applebloom frowned in concern.
I guess stopping the bleeding doesn't stop the pain, huh?
She remarked before putting her first aid kit away.
Do y'all think you can walk?
BB nodded shakily, starting to sit up. He groaned with strain as he did so, but was able to make it.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, good. Do you mind telling me where your house is?
Applebloom inquired gently.
You're still hurt. And I don't want you meandering out here all by yourself if you stay that way. I can take you home if you'd like.
Bibi blinked and stared at her for a moment in disbelief. He then looked up and around at their surroundings, hoping that maybe he'd missed something in his earlier panic.
Well, I kinda got lost,
he mumbled as he realized that he still had absolutely no idea where he was.
Don't worry about it. You know, I know all about what it's like to be lost,
Apple Bloom revealed as she lifted her now sealed backpack onto her back.
I came out here into the woods one day to wander and explore for a while. Kinda wanted to get away from my farm and my family for a bit, just see the world around me. And let me tell you, I got hopelessly lost. I was wandering around for what must have been ages just trying to get home. It was dark when I finally found someone familiar, and Granny Smith grounded me for the rest of the week. Wasn't fun.
Bibi managed to offer her a small smile as she told him that.
Well, I'm glad you found your way back. So am I.
Apple Bloom agreed.
But that was a couple years ago. I kind of know these woods by now, so tell you what. Let me take you home. And you won't have to worry about being lost. Sound good?
Bibi blinked at her in confusion and recoiled in surprise when she held out a hand. He thought about the gesture, then lifted one of his own, his fingers curled into a fist to imitate his hoof. Before he had any time to correct himself, though, Apple Bloom firmly grasped his wrist and helped him to his feet. Once he was in a standing position, a combination of pain and a complete lack of familiarity with being on two legs made him fall forward against Apple Bloom with a yelp.
Whoa, Nellie,
she exclaimed as she caught him and helped him back up.
You all right?
Bibi sniffled quietly but nodded.
I think so. Thank you, miss.
He planted his feet for a moment and soon found his balance. Now that he was standing, he could compare himself to Apple Bloom properly. She was definitely bigger than him, standing almost a full head taller. She was also in significantly better physical shape, as he could see that her muscles were well defined. With some measure of irritation, he realized that his usually scrawny physique had carried over into this form too, making him look like a twig when compared to her.
Baby?
Apple Bloom asked, drawing his attention.
What's your house look like?
Bibi perked up, then looked around again.
Well, my house is big and brown. It has a nice fence and a big backyard with a lot of green grass. The front is all gravelly and stuff, and it has 2 floors.
Apple Bloom's eyes lit up with recognition, as did the air around her.
Oh, yeah, I know where that is,
she said while dropping a closed fist into an open palm. She then smiled and crouched down to be at Bibi's eye level.
All right, so, you feeling good enough to walk back? I think so, yeah.
Bibi dumbly responded. Apple Bloom nodded.
Okay.
She lifted up one hand and held it out to him.
Take my hand, all right? Go ahead and lean on me. That's it. Take the weight off the leg. I'll take you home to your mom and pa.
Bibi timidly reached out, and soon Apple Bloom took his hand in hers. His eyes widened when he realized how much strength there were in her fingers. On top of that, her skin was a strange combination of smooth and rough, as if once pristine hands had gotten roughed up from misuse or overuse. Apple Bloom rose to her full height, lightly pulled Bibi a little closer to her side, and the two began to walk through the woods. She let him lean on her to take the weight off of his wounded leg, something which he was immensely grateful for. Their journey was made in utter silence for the first several minutes, aside from the exclamations both parties made as Bibi occasionally stumbled.
How did Dad ever get around on these things?
He asked in frustration while shooting his lanky legs an irritated glare.
You know, I don't think I've ever seen you around.
Apple Bloom suddenly piped up, drawing a confused look from Bibi.
You new to the area or something?
Bibi looked away, his mind racing for an excuse. He then shrugged his shoulders and settled for a version of the truth.
I don't really leave my house very much. Not without Dad, at least. Well, I mean, a guy as small and skinny as you? No offense or nothing, but you really shouldn't be out in the woods by yourself. Where is your papa, anyway?
BB sagged and let out a quiet sigh.
He isn't home right now. I had a really scary dream last night and I couldn't get back to sleep because it was still scaring me. I got so bored. I wanted to play outside for a while. I thought I could make myself tired and go back to sleep. What about your mama?
Apple Bloom pressed curiously.
Is she not home either?
BB looked down and away, his mood plummeting extremely quickly.
I don't have a mom,
he said softly, and the air around him immediately turned blue with Apple Bloom's guilt.
I never did. Gosh. I'm so sorry to hear that, baby.
Apple Bloom said apologetically, slowing her pace down.
That must be hard.
BB shrugged, looking back up at her.
I don't know. I never had a mom, but my dad's a really good man. I love him a lot.
Apple Bloom smiled in response to that.
Well, that's good. What's he like, if you don't mind me asking?
BB looked ahead, his mind wandering to the man in question. His face began to blossom with a small smile, and he opened his mouth to speak.
Well, my dad is really nice and friendly, and he works at the big park not far away from here. He fixes the trails or something. He hugs me every morning, he lets me sleep in his lap when he gets home, and he never lets me go hungry. He's really...
Suddenly, BB's explanation was silenced as a sharp spike of pain went through his skull. He stumbled forward with a cry of pain, and was only able to stay on his feet because he was leaning on Apple Bloom. He screwed his eyes shut when he felt his transformation starting to slip away again. His heart beat frantically in his chest, sending adrenaline pumping through his veins. With an inward growl of effort, he was just barely able to stabilize his spell and hold his shape, for now at least.
Whoa, are you okay?
Apple Bloom asked, helping BB right himself.
Are you alright? Do you need a rest?
He caught his breath after a few moments and shook his head.
No, I'm okay. I just had a headache, that's all. I get them sometimes.
He half lied before looking around again. His pained grimace slowly began to turn more hopeful.
Oh, I think I remember this spot. We're close to my house.
Apple Bloom looked around, then looked forward with a small smile.
See? Told you you'd be fine. Let me at least get to your door, right? We're not far now.
She suggested, before the two continued walking. BB nodded happily, eager to get back home and get some much-needed rest.
Yeah.
Apple Bloom smiled appreciatively at his enthusiasm, and their journey resumed. BB had been right. They weren't very far. In only a few minutes, they stepped past the tree line and came face to face with the familiar fence that enclosed BB's backyard. From there, they walked around and were soon coming up to the front door. Apple Bloom's hold on BB grew somewhat weaker, and then she let him go once they were by the door. She gave him one more look up and down before she placed her hands behind her back.
Okay, you gonna be alright?
She asked quietly, her expression concerned.
I don't want to leave you here all on your own if not.
BB gave her a thankful smile and a nod.
Yeah, I'll be okay now, I think. I'll just go inside and wait for my dad to come home. He'll take care of me. He always does.
Apple Bloom frowned as she heard that. and Bibi could tell she was recalling that he didn't have a mom. She glanced at the door, then at Bibi again, her worry growing.
Are you sure? Is there anybody else here?
Bibi shook his head.
No. But I can just nap on the couch for now. Hey.
He leaned his head back to let out a large and unattractive yawn. Once it had passed, he gave Applebloom a sheepish smile.
I think I probably need some nap time.
Applebloom let out a quiet huff of laughter before looking into Bibi's eyes. It was like she was searching for something. After a moment of silence, she must have found it, because she knelt down a little and put a hand on Bibi's shoulder.
I'm sorry you don't have a mom. But let me tell you something. I don't have one either.
Bibi looked up at her in shock.
Wait, what? You don't?
He stammered, not sure he really believed her. Applebloom shook her head.
Nope. Don't got a dad neither. They both, well, I lost him before I ever got to know him.
She explained gently, the air around her turning a dark shade of blue with little swirls of black.
So I get you, Bibi. At least a little. My big sis and big bro take care of me along with our granny.
Bibi looked at her for a few moments, his mind reeling. He then swallowed the lump in his throat and gave her a stiff nod.
Well, all right. Thank you very much for helping me, Miss Applebloom.
He mumbled weakly. Applebloom gave him a small smile before pulling her hand back and rising to her full height.
Oh, shucks. It's just Applebloom, or AB for short. And you're very welcome, Bibi. I'll be seeing you around,
she said cheerfully before turning and walking back down the path. Bibi frowned in confusion.
You will?
He called after her. She paused a few steps down the path and turned to smile back at him.
Sure I will. We're friends now, ain't we?
Bibi's brain stalled the moment he heard that, and for a second he stood there, his jaw gaping open while his eyes bored into Applebloom's. After a moment, he snapped out of it and nodded.
Yeah. Friends,
he mumbled. Applebloom maintained her cheerful expression, though Bibi did see a subtle dark blue tint seep into the air around her again. Was she disappointed by his response? Before he could think to correct himself, though, Applebloom spun around on her heels and kept going. She waved at him over her shoulder.
See you around, Bibi. Take care of that leg. Bye.
Bibi watched her go, unsure of what to say. His eyes followed her intently until she disappeared around the side of his house. After a few minutes, the sound of her shoes in the grass faded away entirely, leaving Bibi all on his own. Green fire swirled around him, then faded to reveal that he had gone back to his normal self. He collapsed against the door, gasping desperately for breath as his exhaustion reared its ugly head. With a wheeze, he lit his horn, and despite all the pain it caused him, undid the lock on the inside and opened the door. He took a few stumbling steps forwards before collapsing to the floor in a gasping and twitching heap. He just had enough presence of mind to close the door behind him before he was completely and utterly spent. His vision began to grow hazy, and his eyelids heavy. Sleep reached for him, and he found himself unwilling to resist its siren call. But as he fell away from the waking world and plunged into the world of dreams, one last thought tickled his mind. Applebloom had called him her friend. A smile crossed his face as he fell asleep. He liked the sound of that.